Did you know that some countries might not welcome Canadians in 2025? It's surprising, but true. As travel restrictions and geopolitical tensions evolve, certain nations have become less friendly towards Canadian travelers. In this video, we reveal the top 10 countries where Canadians are not welcome in 2025. Whether it's due to strained diplomatic relations or strict visa policies, these destinations are becoming harder to access. Are you planning a trip abroad? You might want to double-check these locations on your list. We'll dive into the reasons behind these restrictions and what they mean for Canadian travelers. Stay informed and avoid unexpected surprises. Subscribe for more travel updates, and let us know in the comments if you've encountered any challenges while traveling with a Canadian passport. Number 10. North Korea. North Korea is one of the most closed-off countries in the world, and in 2025, it remains nearly impossible for Canadians to visit. The North Korean government strictly controls who enters the country, and diplomatic relations with Canada are strained. Since 2010, Canada has maintained limited diplomatic contact with North Korea, and in response, the regime has made it difficult for Canadian citizens to obtain visas. Even if you were granted entry, traveling within North Korea is highly restricted. Tourists are required to be accompanied by government-approved guides at all times, and any perceived disrespect toward the country's leadership could lead to severe consequences, including imprisonment. Canadians have been detained in North Korea before, and with rising global tensions, the risks are higher than ever. Adding to the danger, Canada has issued a strict travel advisory, warning citizens to avoid all travel to North Korea. There is no Canadian embassy in the country, meaning that if something goes wrong, there's little to no help available. Given the unpredictable nature of North Korea's government and its history of detaining foreigners, it's one of the least welcoming destinations for Canadians, or any tourists, in 2025. Number 9. Iran. Iran has long had complicated relations with Canada, and in 2025, those tensions remain high. Since 2012, diplomatic ties between the two nations have been severed, meaning that Canada does not have an embassy in Iran to provide assistance to its citizens. This alone makes it a risky destination. In recent years, Iran has imposed strict visa policies for Canadian travelers, making it difficult, if not impossible, for many to enter. While some Canadians have been able to obtain visas for tourism or business, they are often subject to intense screening upon arrival. The Iranian government has also detained foreign nationals, including dual citizens, on accusations of espionage or political crimes, making it a dangerous destination for Canadians. Another factor making Iran unwelcoming is its complex relationship with Western countries. Canadian citizens have reported denials at the border, unexpected visa rejections, and even surveillance by local authorities while traveling in Iran. Women traveling alone face additional restrictions, including mandatory hijab laws and rules limiting movement without a male guardian in certain situations. With the political situation remaining uncertain and the risk of arbitrary detention, Iran remains one of the least welcoming destinations for Canadians in 2025. Number 8. Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a wealthy and influential country in the Middle East, but it has never been the easiest place for Canadians to visit. In 2025, relations between Canada and Saudi Arabia remain tense, making it difficult for Canadians to obtain visas. The diplomatic conflict between the two nations began in 2018 when Canada criticized Saudi Arabia's human rights policies. In retaliation, Saudi Arabia expelled the Canadian ambassador, suspended trade agreements, and froze new visas for Canadian citizens. While relations have somewhat stabilized, visa approvals remain unpredictable. Even if a Canadian does obtain a visa, Saudi Arabia has strict laws that travelers must follow. The country enforces conservative Islamic laws, meaning things like public displays of affection, alcohol consumption, and certain dress codes can lead to legal trouble. Women travelers face additional challenges, including restrictions on movement and dress requirements. For those considering a trip, Saudi Arabia's unpredictable visa policies and strict legal system make it one of the least welcoming places for Canadians in 2025. Number 7. Venezuela. Venezuela is in the midst of a long-running political and economic crisis, and as a result, it has become extremely difficult for Canadians to visit. The country has experienced hyperinflation, food shortages, and widespread crime, making it one of the most dangerous places for foreign travelers. In 2019, Venezuela expelled Canadian diplomats and shut down its embassy in Ottawa. Since then, diplomatic relations between the two countries have remained frozen, meaning there is no Canadian consular support in Venezuela. If a Canadian gets into legal trouble or needs emergency assistance, there's no official help available. Additionally, Venezuela has one of the highest crime rates in the world, with frequent reports of kidnappings, violent robberies, and corruption. Even travelers who manage to obtain visas face the risk of being targeted by criminals or encountering government crackdowns on dissent. With high crime rates, lack of diplomatic relations, and political instability, Venezuela remains an extremely unwelcoming destination for Canadians in 2025. Number 6. Syria. Syria has been embroiled in civil war for over a decade, and in 2025, it remains one of the most dangerous places in the world. For Canadians, visiting Syria is nearly impossible, as the Canadian government has issued an avoid all travel advisory due to security concerns. The Syrian government is highly suspicious of foreign visitors, and Canadians attempting to enter could be detained or interrogated. Additionally, the presence of armed groups, ongoing conflict, and bombings make it an active war zone. Even if the war were to subside, Syria's visa policies remain strict, and diplomatic relations with Canada are minimal. Without an embassy, there's no support for Canadians in case of an emergency. With ongoing instability and a lack of diplomatic support, Syria remains a completely unwelcoming destination for Canadians in 2025. Number 5. Somalia. Somalia has long been associated with piracy, terrorism, and political instability, making it one of the most dangerous countries in the world for travelers, including Canadians. The country has struggled with lawlessness for decades, and obtaining a visa is nearly impossible due to the weak central government's inability to control large portions of its territory. Even if a Canadian manages to secure entry, the risks are immense, as foreign nationals are often prime targets for kidnappings and attacks. The terrorist group Al-Shabaab, which is designated as a terrorist organization by Canada, has a strong presence in Somalia and frequently carries out bombings, assassinations, and mass attacks. The group has a history of targeting foreigners, and kidnappings for ransom are common. Additionally, Somalia lacks a functioning legal system in many areas, meaning that even minor disputes or misunderstandings can lead to severe consequences. The Canadian government has issued a strict avoid all travel advisory for Somalia, emphasizing the lack of diplomatic support in case of emergencies. With no embassy or consular services, Canadians who find themselves in trouble have virtually no means of securing help. Due to the extreme risks of violence, kidnapping, and lack of government stability, Somalia remains one of the most unwelcoming destinations for Canadians in 2025. Number 4. Afghanistan. Since the Taliban retook control of Afghanistan in 2021, the country has become increasingly isolated from the international community, and diplomatic relations with Canada are virtually non-existent. The Taliban government does not recognize Canadian diplomatic influence, making it nearly impossible for Canadians to obtain visas. Even if entry were granted, the risks of traveling in Afghanistan are incredibly high due to ongoing security threats, including terrorism, kidnappings, and human rights violations. The Taliban's strict enforcement of Islamic law makes it particularly dangerous for Western travelers, especially women. Canadians visiting Afghanistan face the possibility of being detained, harassed, or accused of espionage. Journalists, aid workers, and dual citizens have been specifically targeted in the past. The risk of arbitrary arrest, forced disappearances, and lack of due process make it one of the riskiest places for Canadians to visit. Adding to the danger, there is no Canadian embassy or consular support in Afghanistan. If a Canadian were to encounter trouble, there would be no diplomatic means to secure their release or ensure their safety. The unstable security situation, ongoing violence, and lack of any reliable support system make Afghanistan one of the least welcoming countries for Canadians in 2025. Number 3. Yemen. Yemen has been engulfed in a devastating civil war for nearly a decade, making it one of the most dangerous places in the world. The conflict between the internationally recognized government, Houthi rebels, and extremist groups like Al-Qaeda has left the country in ruins, with ongoing violence, famine, and humanitarian crises. The situation is so dire that Canada has issued a strict avoid all travel warning for Yemen, as it remains an active war zone with no functioning government or security system. For Canadians attempting to enter Yemen, the challenges are immense. The visa process is extremely difficult, and even if granted entry, foreigners are at high risk of being kidnapped by militias or terrorist groups. Ransom kidnappings are common, and Westerners are often targeted due to perceived political ties. The country also faces constant airstrikes, bombings, and military clashes, making movement within Yemen extremely dangerous. There is no Canadian embassy in Yemen, meaning that Canadians who get into trouble will have no diplomatic assistance. The combination of extreme violence, lawlessness, and humanitarian disaster makes Yemen one of the most unwelcoming and unsafe destinations for Canadians in 2025. Number 2, Iraq. While Iraq has made progress in rebuilding after years of war, many parts of the country remain highly unstable. Terrorist attacks, political unrest, and armed militias still pose serious risks to travelers, and for Canadians, obtaining a visa is extremely difficult. Even if entry is granted, the risks of being detained, kidnapped, or caught in violent conflict remain high. One of the biggest threats facing Canadians in Iraq is the presence of terrorist groups like ISIS, which, despite being significantly weakened, still carries out attacks. Militias operating outside government control also pose a danger, particularly in regions with ongoing sectarian violence. Kidnappings of Westerners are common, and security forces are often unable, or unwilling, to intervene. The Canadian government strongly advises against all travel to Iraq, emphasizing the high risk of terrorist attacks, armed conflict, and lawlessness. Canada does not have a fully operational embassy in Iraq, meaning that diplomatic support is extremely limited. Even in areas that are considered safer, sudden outbreaks of violence can put travelers in immediate danger. For these reasons, Iraq remains one of the least welcoming countries for Canadians in 2025. Number 1, Libya. Libya has been in a state of chaos since the fall of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, and in 2025, the situation remains highly unstable. The country is divided between multiple rival factions, and armed militias control large portions of Libyan territory. For Canadians, obtaining a visa is nearly impossible, and even if granted entry, the risks are extremely high. Libya is one of the most dangerous countries for foreigners due to ongoing conflict, terrorism, and the widespread presence of armed groups. Kidnappings, assassinations, and violent crime are rampant, and Westerners are often targeted. The situation is so volatile that even experienced war journalists and humanitarian workers are hesitant to enter. Adding to the dangers, Canada does not have an embassy in Libya, meaning there is no consular support if a Canadian traveler is in danger. The country remains under multiple international travel warnings, and the Canadian government strongly advises against all travel to Libya. With no stable government, widespread violence, and a severe lack of security, Libya is the most unwelcoming country for Canadians in 2025. Conclusion: traveling the world is a dream for many, but in 2025, some destinations are simply too risky or too restricted for Canadians. Whether due to political tensions, visa restrictions, or security concerns, these 10 countries have become increasingly difficult for Canadian travelers to access. If you're planning an international trip, always check government travel advisories and stay updated on changing policies. Your safety should always come first. What do you think about these travel restrictions? Have you ever faced challenges traveling as a Canadian? Share your experiences in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more travel updates. Safe travels.